Hi, this is Bill, and welcome to Progpaganda. Over the course of our last several episodes, we've been running down our list of 25 proto-prog albums, the 25 albums from the late 1960s that helped to influence and shape the genre of music that has since come to be known as progressive rock. In an earlier episode, we went over the full list of 25 albums and identify the criteria we used for selecting the 25. If you haven't seen that episode yet, feel free to check that out at this link. We've also done deep dive reviews on several of the albums, going over various recordings at this point from 1965, 66, and 1967. Feel free to check those out as well. I think you'll enjoy them. We're continuing our dive through the list with today's episode, covering a landmark album from August of 1967, the psychedelic masterpiece from Pink Floyd, their debut album, the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now, I'm sure that if I were to approach most prog rock fans and mention this album to them and ask what they thought the album's distinguishing characteristic was, I'm sure that I would receive several answers. The first, probably the most prevalent, would be that the album is defined by the presence of Pink Floyd's original band leader, Syd Barrett. Barrett was not only Pink Floyd's band leader at the time, he was their primary creative force. He wrote most of their songs. He was their lead singer. He was their guitarist, and a somewhat innovative one at that. Others, I'm sure, would identify the album as a psychedelic music landmark, and indeed, it really is a wonderful album in that regard. And it's a unique one in that it took psychedelic music down something of a different path than other albums that were exploring psychedelia in 1966 and 67. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. The third and possibly most ominous answer that I might receive around this album would be around the influence of LSD on its content. And there is certainly a bit of that. Syd Barrett was unabashed in his use of the drug and was an advocate of using the drug to help influence his music and his compositional style. And unfortunately, took that perhaps to an extreme that cost him dearly in his art and ultimately in his life. The various members of Pink Floyd began working together as far back as 1963, when architecture students Roger Waters, Rick Wright, and Nick Mason began working with various guitar players, ultimately joining forces with Syd Barrett, who was an art school student a couple of years younger than the three of them were. They worked together in several band configurations, ultimately christening themselves as Pink Floyd in late 1965, and began attracting public attention shortly thereafter. Pink Floyd in 1966 became one of the prevailing acts on the London Underground circuit. They were a resident act in particular at a club called the UFO Club, which specialized in experimental music and, for better or for worse, attracted a lot of patrons who were into the use of narcotics, in particular LSD. This was a somewhat new phenomenon in the UK at the time. Drugs, of course, were not an alien thing to the music business, certainly. In the United States, marijuana and heroin were around the jazz scene going back to at least the 1940s. But when it came to rock and roll, record companies were very quick to when they noticed that their artists were having problems with drugs, to keep it out of the public eye, and in some cases to eliminate the artists from public view entirely. They were very careful about their reputations. They didn't want to be perceived as putting artists who embraced drug use in front of impressionable teenagers who would consume their music. They just were not wanting to do that. One of the things that made Pink Floyd somewhat unique in this regard was that Syd Barrett was totally unashamed with regard to his use of LSD. He felt that the drug helped to inform his creative process and was very candid with the public and with the rock and roll press about his usage of the drug. Pink Floyd's approach to psychedelic music was interesting in the sense that from the very beginning, they seemed to explore the two opposite ends of the genre. At the UFO Club in live performance, they would pursue improvisational, experimental styles. Barrett's more polished compositions were very melodic in style, very tuneful, often whimsical in content, and sometimes childlike in delivery, and very memorable as a result. By comparison, most psychedelic music that was being pursued in 1966 and 1967 did not come from free jazz or from original composition. It came either from jamming around blues progressions, or in other, sometimes more sophisticated cases, from the use of Eastern or Indian scales in the composition of the music. So Pink Floyd's taking an experimental approach for some songs and taking a strictly compositional approach for others made them rather unique. By late 1966 and early 1967, Pink Floyd had enough of a public profile from their appearances on the underground circuit that they began attracting record company attention. They, in particular, were pursued by two record labels, the Polydor label, which had a fairly large presence in Europe and also was beginning to make inroads into the United States through a distribution deal they had with Atlantic Records. The other label was EMI, and this was significant for a number of reasons. EMI was, of course, the label of the Beatles, whom Pink Floyd admired, and EMI was a label that in some regards was experiencing a bit of change and were beginning to take some chances in terms of expanding their roster. George Martin had been, until late 1965, one of the senior executives at EMI. He was the head of Parlophone Records and, of course, was the lead caretaker of EMI's recording facilities at Abbey Road. By 1965, Martin had resigned from EMI to begin his own recording operation, Air Studios, although he remained as the Beatles producer. His recording engineer, who worked with him on Beatles recordings, Norman Smith, took over Parlophone and, for a brief time at least, took over Abbey Road. And Norman Smith was particularly interested in Pink Floyd. In Smith's eyes, Pink Floyd were something of a natural successor to the Beatles. He viewed Syd Barrett's compositional style and his vocal style as somewhat similar to those of John Lennon. And Smith's feeling was that he could help to mold Pink Floyd into maybe not becoming a full-fledged Beatles clone, but to certainly take cues from the work the Beatles were doing in order to become successful in their own right. And certainly with the facilities and the staff at Abbey Road who had worked on Beatles recordings, along with Smith himself, he was in a position to try and make that happen. Pink Floyd ultimately signed with EMI after EMI offered them a rather interesting contract, certainly an interesting one for a new band in particular. The contract had two stipulations that were very unique for the time. One was that Pink Floyd was effectively given complete creative control of their work. The feeling was that they were a unique enough band with a very established following in the UK that they would likely be commercially successful, and as such, that they didn't need a full-time producer to ride herd over them in order to achieve that success. Norman Smith, in particular, took the approach that he would loosely steer the ship to ensure commercial success of the band's ventures, but that the band would be in control of the creative process. Smith encouraged Pink Floyd very early on to establish home studios and to own as much of the production process as possible. And that was something that was embraced by all the members of the band. The other thing about the contract that was notable was that by most accounts, it effectively offered the band completely free studio time to allow them to realize their creative visions in the manner that they saw fit. This was a really big deal because most bands back in the day did not have free studio time. Quite to the contrary, all studio time was charged back to the band and recouped via the royalties of the records they sold. Pink Floyd's getting this opportunity to have as much studio time as Abbey Road as they needed, with the quality of the technicians and producers that they would work with at Abbey Road, showed a tremendous amount of faith in the band and their ability to achieve success. Pink Floyd signed to EMI in the spring of 1967, and they began work with the label through the release of 2 singles. The first single was Arnold Lane, which was a moderate success despite the fact that Radio London banned it for content. Arnold Lane, if you're not familiar with the song, discusses the exploits of a kleptomaniac transvestite who steals women's underwear from a clothesline. You can see perhaps why Radio London wasn't terribly excited with that one. Despite the ban, however, the record made it to number 20 on the English charts, establishing Pink Floyd as a band to watch. Their second single was the classic See Emily Play, which made it to number 5. And the success of that single made it clear to Norman Smith and to EMI that a Pink Floyd album needed to go into the works. And it did in the late spring. Pink Floyd spent about 2 months in the late spring and early summer of 1967 working on the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Piper is an interesting album from a content perspective. As I mentioned, Pink Floyd had the 2 extremes of its psychedelic approach in terms of the experimental and the whimsical, and both of those appear on the album. The 8 songs that Syd Barrett wrote for the album are very much the melodic style of the singles, and at least a couple of those were released as singles over the course as well. 2 songs on the album, however, are very much the improvisational experimental style that was explored at the UFO Club. One of those became something of a Pink Floyd classic in concert, even following Syd Barrett's ultimate departure from the band. That song is, of course, Interstellar Overdrive. Another song, Power Torch, is of a similar approach, although somewhat shorter than Interstellar Overdrive, which takes fully half of side 2 of the Piper album. The final song, perhaps something of an indicator of things to come, is an early composition by bass player Roger Waters, Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk. The experimental music of Pink Floyd is worth discussing to some level of degree, in part because Pink Floyd, at this point in time, weren't what I'd call deeply proficient musicians. Rick Wright was certainly a well-schooled keyboard player and knew music well, but he wasn't embracing composition very much on his own at this point in time. He was more taking a free-form jamming approach to the music. The rhythm section of Roger Waters and Nick Mason wasn't particularly strong, and it could be argued that even in the later versions of Pink Floyd, the rhythm section was always the part that musically was the weakest. Syd Barrett was an interesting guitar player in terms of his approach. I don't know that I would call him technically proficient, but he certainly was very interested in exploring the capabilities of the guitar in both conventional and non-conventional means. He was more than happy to work with the engineers at Abbey Road on special effects, and in some cases would go so far as to approach his guitar playing it through unconventional means, using things like a cigarette lighter as a slide, rolling ball bearings across the strings in order to see what kinds of sounds he could get out of it from that point of view. So in that regard, Barrett was, if nothing else, innovative. The Piper at the Gates of Dawn was released in August of 1967 and was a top 10 album in the UK. It did less well in the United States. Quite frankly, the United States did not really know what to do with it. I think the executives at EMI were somewhat concerned because of the very obvious drug connotations that the band and the music seemed to have. Norman Smith, I'm sure, contributed to some of their view of the album as well in the United States, in that by Smith's account, as the album was being made and as the stress level got higher in the studio, that Barrett began more frequently taking acid, and as a result became more detached and somewhat more combative in the latter days of the sessions. Certainly, if Smith reported this to the executives in the United States, this couldn't have been taken very well. The bottom line is that the American operation of EMI did not support the record very well. The album did not crack the top 100 in the United States, but perhaps even more importantly, the album was not placed on one of the primary EMI labels in the States. Most EMI recordings from major artists, such as, for example, the Beatles and the Beach Boys, would be released by EMI on Capitol Records. Second-tier acts at EMI were usually relegated to their Tower Records label, which was usually a sign that these acts didn't require significant promotion. They might be regional acts. They might be viewed out of the gate as having a very specific genre that could relegate them as being one-hit wonders. Pink Floyd's first two albums, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn and A Saucer Full of Secrets, were released on the Tower label, which was something that definitely caught the attention of Pink Floyd and their managers, and not in a good way. This was a piece of resentment that Roger Waters in particular would harbor for years afterwards, and would even mention it as part of Pink Floyd's ultimate severing of their American contract with EMI Capitol in the middle 70s after the success of The Dark Side of the Moon. Sadly, Syd Barrett did not last very much longer in Pink Floyd after the release of the Piper album. His health did begin to deteriorate following release of the album, and more than a few people believe that that is because of his increased intake of LSD. Barrett became more difficult to deal with, more detached from the rest of the band. In some cases, he was openly hostile, particularly when doing interviews on radio or on television. He would, on television, refuse on occasion to participate in lip syncs of the singles that were being promoted. In other cases, would just go out of his way to be difficult on screen. And it became clear in a hurry that something needed to be done about the situation. By late 1967, a fifth member of Pink Floyd, David Gilmour, was brought in to play guitar with the idea that Gilmour would effectively be a proxy for Barrett on stage. The thinking was that Barrett could remain the creative force of the band and provide songs to the band, but that Gilmour would be on stage to help carry them out in performance and to also carry them out in the studio when necessary. This, however, didn't last for very long either. Barrett's resentment came through as time went on and as his drug use increased. And ultimately, by the spring of 1968, during the sessions for A Saucerful of Secrets, it was determined that Barrett couldn't continue with the band, and he was dismissed from the band in April of 1968. So what made Pink Floyd and the Piper at the Gates of Dawn important to the early stages of progressive rock? Well, there are a few things. Some of them are musical, some of them not necessarily so, but all of them are important. From a musical perspective, Pink Floyd broke a lot of rules. They were not, by virtue of the contract they signed and the freedom they had based on that contract, they didn't really have to go out of their way to make quote-unquote hit singles. They did the type of music they wanted. Some of that was very interesting and entertaining. Some of it was on the borderline of bizarre, but nevertheless, it was the music they wanted to make. They used their artistic control in a way that really very few bands had done so before them. Their association with the drug culture, while perhaps not a positive, wasn't in the context of 1967 that strong a negative, really. Going back to 1965 in San Francisco, Americans had already begun seeing some of the drug culture and its early influences on music through things like, for example, the acid tests that Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters would run with bands like the Grateful Dead and Big Brother of the Holding Company. So at least the more sophisticated listeners in the States weren't totally closed to the idea that these bands could make interesting and entertaining music. The fact that Pink Floyd didn't sell very many records in the early days of the United States was more of a factor of their record company getting behind them, in my opinion. So in some regards, Pink Floyd's approach, despite or perhaps because of their drug use, might have been a case of right place, right time. Also, from a technology perspective, Pink Floyd's music was right place, right time in the American marketplace in 1967 as well. By late 1967, American music listeners began going outside of AM top 40 radio for the music they were consuming, and instead going to the FM dial, which broadcast in stereo in many markets, and was able to accommodate music that was longer in form, not unlike what Pink Floyd and some of their American contemporaries were doing. So there was a new market being opened up for their music that prior to 1967 wouldn't have been available. Pink Floyd and these other bands might have been the lucky recipients of it, but nevertheless, they happened to be among the first that were able to take advantage of it, and so they did. The Piper at the Gates of Dawn is, of course, a very different album by virtue of Syd Barrett's participation than the rest of Pink Floyd's catalog. And of course, Pink Floyd, under Roger Waters and David Gilmour's leadership, would make some wonderful records over the course of the 1970s especially. But I don't know that they would have had the opportunity to make those records, and certainly the circumstances under which those records were made wouldn't have happened the same way with that Piper happening first. So the Piper at the Gates of Dawn is definitely an historical touchstone in that sense. If you haven't heard it, you should. You'll be quite surprised at how interesting and entertaining Syd Barrett's music and voice are, and how unique they are. It's a shame that he didn't continue to create music for us longer than he did. Anyway, that is all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you're seeing in this series so far, please feel free to let us know with your comments. Please click like on the video. Please subscribe to the channel. And we'll do our best to continue to create entertaining content for you. Our next episode will take us to December of 1967 and the album that Mick Jagger has identified as the Rolling Stones' worst record. Not sure I agree with him there. Their Satanic Majesty's Request is next on our list. Thanks very much for listening. You take good care.